Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome to Conversations. I'm pleased to be joined today, again, I think for the fourth time, by my friend Stan Veuger, a senior fellow in economics at the American Enterprise Institute, a specialist in political economy and public finance, but many other fields as well. Contributor to, of course, specialized academic journals, peer-reviewed and all that, but also contributor to the public presses. Stan lectures at Harvard and other universities in Europe and maybe even further afield. So, Stan, thanks for joining me again today.
Thank you, Bill. Delighted to be back.
It's good to have you. Our last conversation was in May of 2021, I think, and before that, June 2020, shortly after the pandemic began. And I looked over those, and your sense of where things might be going stands up well. You'll be glad to know in retrospect. But maybe we should begin with that. I mean, it's been a kind of an amazing 2.5 years, a global pandemic, then a war in Ukraine, which has had major economic effects. I mean, if you incorporate all that, where are we? Are we better off than you might have expected? Worse off? What's sort of the big, drawing the telescope back for a minute? What's the big picture before we get into inflation and all the actual more concrete issues?
Yeah, so I think if you go back to the sort of the start of the pandemic period, say May 2020, if you compare where we are now to where we were expected to be now at that time, we're significantly better off in key respects. So in May 2020, CBO expected the unemployment rate to be 8.2% now, right? And it's
now 8.2% now in 20. What are we talking? Just to get to clarity, June 2021, 22, right?
Yes, and instead we're at 3.6%, right? So that's dramatically better. We're basically back at full employment, though labor force participation is a little lower, but we're not at those kinds of skyrocketing unemployment rates. In addition, by the end of last year, real GDP, which is the total output of the economy, had converged back to where CBO expected the economy to be by the end of 2021, when it made its final pre-pandemic forecast. So in January 2020, it made a prediction of what's the economy going to be like the end of 2021, and that's basically where we were at the end of last year. So that's quite good, right? So in those two senses, we've completely overcome the pandemic shock.
And is that true sort of globally, or at least in the advanced industrial world generally? Would that be a fair?
No. So the US is doing significantly better, especially on the output front, than other countries. Other advanced economies, if you look at the sort of the IMF World Economic Outlook, other advanced economies are not expected to really return the trend until 2024. So the US has really caught up a bit faster. Of course, in the last few months, things have not gotten better. The war in Ukraine has been very disruptive, and the Federal Reserve's response to one of the more negative aspects of where we are, to high levels of inflation, has also slowed down growth a little bit. So we're not doing quite as well as we were doing at the end of last year, but still dramatically better than I think people expected right after the pandemic hit. To give you a sense of on the output front, in May 2020, CBO expected us to be about 5.5% below trend at the end of 2021, and instead we had fully caught up. So that's a tremendous accomplishment, I think.
And this is despite not handling the pandemic terribly well, I think. Because you stressed in the early conversation, I think correctly, it seemed to me, that a huge amount depended on how quickly we got the vaccine, and how quickly people obviously took it, how much, we didn't talk about Delta, but how much the whole thing would be sort of under control. I think if one looked back, one would have to say it's been less under control over those 2 years than perhaps we expected or hoped early on. And yet still we're back on trend, which is a little startling, I guess. I mean,
I think that's true. So I think the vaccine arrived faster than people expected, but then reasonable levels of vaccination took much more effort to get to, and one could argue that in parts of the country, and certainly in large parts of the world, we have not hit yet. So as a result, I think the recovery during the second half of 2021 was a little more uneven than expected, and I think part of the uptick in inflation can also be explained by the fact that we have not fully rebalanced to the kind of distribution between services and goods that we had before the pandemic. Of course, the global lack of vaccination has caused problems, especially in China, that directly affect the US economically through disruptions to supply chains. And of course, at home, one of the categories of products that really have seen large increases in prices is housing. And there, I think part of the reason why is that because the pandemic is not entirely gone from people's minds, many more people are still working from home, and as a result, their demand for housing has gone up. And so I do think that our inability to completely vaccinate the population and really be done with COVID once and for all, I do think has hampered the recovery a little bit and explains at least some part of the elevated levels of inflation that we're seeing.
Well, let's get into inflation, because that's the sort of headline for people here in the U.S., certainly at least for voters, apparently. And we'll get to the sort of supply side effects that inflation, which I think you've written, and I'm very inclined this way, are being under kind of reported compared to monetary and fiscal policy, which are I guess, do affect presumably aggregate demand quite a lot. But let's talk a bit about that. I mean, how much is what most people now think is the excessive size of the recovery plan, the rescue plan? How much is expansionary fiscal policy responsible for inflation? How much was the Fed slow in removing the punch bowl? And then we can get to the supply side, because obviously people do forget this. That you reminded me of this the other day, that even Milton Friedman, Mr. Monetary Policy and Mr. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. I seem to remember that vaguely from when I studied economics ages ago. Even he said, look, the supply side matters too. Obviously, it's too much money chasing too few goods. If you have more goods, right? If you don't have supply chain problems, to mention the supply side, literally, you will have less inflation. But so let's maybe begin with the demand side, if that's okay. How many mistakes do we make? How avoidable were those mistakes? And how big a deal are they sort of all in?
Yeah, so current inflation is, if you look at the CPI, which is the index that gets the most media coverage, it's at a little over 8%. If you remove from that energy prices and food prices, which economists often think of as not being as directly under the control of the Federal Reserve, and much more affected by conditions globally, then it's about 6.2%. If you look at the PCE, which is a different metric of inflation that the Federal Reserve prefers, and that is a little broader in the sense that it includes all households as well as nonprofits that serve households, whereas the CPI only looks at urban households. The PCE also looks at all spending and not just out-of-pocket spending, which is what the CPI does. And so, for example, in healthcare, right, a lot of spending is not out of pocket, and so it's not included in the CPI. Anyway, two different metrics of inflation. The PCE is significantly lower at 6.3%. And there again, core inflation, which is what you get if you remove food and energy prices, it's 4.9%. And so both, I think you can say, are, between 3 and 5 points above where we would want to be. Then the question is,
and above where we have been, right? People are not used to this unless you're my age and remember the late 70s.
So for a long, long time now, we've been at or slightly below 2% inflation. Basically, I think it's the over the past decade or so. And so, yeah, for people of my generation, this is really the first time that we've seen, multiple months in a row of numbers that are this high. I think the debate over what has caused this is ongoing, but I think there's a growing consensus that in the United States, much of this increase in inflation is driven by excessive aggregate demand, so to speak. So it's very aggressive fiscal policy and then a relatively slow Federal Reserve response. Now, some of that was, I think, the American Rescue Plan, which is the large stimulus bill that the Biden administration passed early on in its term. But of course, that was preceded by other even larger support packages. And I think it's difficult to allocate, blame, if you want to call it that, to those different support components, right? The previous packages included stimulus checks that in large part went to families that didn't really need them. The Paycheck Protection Program was very poorly targeted in the sense that basically every firm that was eligible could get the money no matter what had happened to their revenue. the unemployment insurance program was expanded in a way that was perhaps unwise, but forcibly so by the way in which that program is set up technologically. And so all of those programs combined led to, I think, too much demand. Of course, keep in mind, it has also had the benefit that we did return to trend and to full employment much more rapidly than other countries, right? So you really see a trade-off here, I think, between higher prices and greater levels of output and employment. And I think one question that's a little unanswered is, was this overheating, was that productive in a way? Did it lead to a faster reconstruction of the supply side of the economy than we otherwise would have seen? And I think there, we don't have a super clear picture yet. So that's, I think, one big factor. Maybe a couple of points of the excess inflation are to blame on those fiscal stimulus programs, and then the Fed's slow response. But as we mentioned earlier, there are other factors. Of course, there's COVID, there's the war in Europe, which maybe in the US has not been as important for inflation, but certainly explains the high levels of inflation in Western Europe, right, which is facing similar levels of inflation right now to the US, despite not having had the same levels of fiscal stimulus. There's the slowdown in China and the problems China is facing with COVID. And there is, I think, also a number of kind of self-inflicted errors, as you're saying, on the supply side. So, for example,
let's get to those in a minute. But the Europe thing is striking because it seems to me that just as a kind of empirical, little test here of if inflation now in Europe is what it is basically in the US, which I think is now the case, and Europe has not pursued as expansionary either expansionary fiscal policy and maybe, I don't know, monetary policy. I don't know how different they've been from us, but it sort of suggests that the, let's call it, supply side of things, energy, for example, and food, food disruptions, and then supply chain disruptions, has a pretty big effect. And we're all obsessed here. The Fed's been slow. Powell should have done this. He should have done that. And everyone's like into that debate because everyone loves to be a Fed watcher and critic. And I'm sure they got things a little wrong, or maybe quite wrong. And of course, then on the fiscal side, something close to a consensus probably that it was all in just too much. But I don't know. I don't want to be totally in the tank for Biden here, God forbid. But I mean, couldn't one say that, or for the U.S. government policymakers, but couldn't one say, if for Biden and for Powell, really, and to some degree, frankly, for Trump, even in 2020, I mean, given the limits of how precisely one can target these things, and given that it's always going to be a little too high or a little too low and a little too much or a little too little and so forth, that net, we haven't seen a massive failure of policy from either, in a funny way, Congress and the administration on the one hand, or the Fed on the other, on the fiscal or monetary fronts, all in. Not to say that it has been targeted perfectly and all that, but the sort of, given what one should expect from these things, it's not necessarily as much of a failure as kind of conventional wisdom now has it. Is that right, or am I being too nice?
I think that's fair. I think the conventional wisdom is a little myopic in that it's looking at the monthly inflation prints and saying these are very high, without really reflecting on what we've been through over the past 2.5 years and how rapid the recovery has been in certain ways, how well we made it through the pandemic in economic terms. I think in relative terms to expectations early in the pandemic, and relative terms to other countries, I think overall the policy response has been quite good. And it's unfortunate that inflation is high now, but I do think it's just one aspect of many, and it shouldn't be completely blown out of proportion. I would push back maybe a little bit on your implicit argument that because inflation in Europe is at the same level as here, that means that excess aggregate demand cannot be a big explanatory factor, because of course in Europe you have other factors that have pushed inflation up high, and of course there are spillovers from U.S. aggregate demand onto the price level elsewhere.
Okay, it's good that you maintained your credibility there by not going into the tank quite as much as I have for Powell and for Biden. But I think that's a good point, actually. Yeah, and it does spill over. So these things are sort of interconnected. You don't have a perfect case study of two separate economies, God knows. And
it is also, I think, in addition, an argument you see people make is, look, once you remove energy and food and a bunch of categories of products that are affected by COVID, if you remove all of those, then inflation looks pretty good. But of course, if all those prices hadn't increased, people would have spent more money on the remaining sets of goods, right? And so inflation in the remainder of categories would have been higher in the absence of those dramatic price increases.
Yeah, no, that's also a good point. Well, let's talk. I mean, maybe just one more word on inflation as a sort of phenomenon that affects. I think voters are very sensitive to it for pretty obvious reasons. It's more direct. You go to the supermarket, especially the gas station, and there it is. And whatever, not being unemployed or getting a little bit more of a raise than you might have gotten otherwise sort of fades into the background compared to this week to week sort of a reminder of the problem. I'm not sure how much social scientists have studied this as a kind of almost psychological or political matter, but I guess I am struck just by how much. And then, of course, saying when you say, well, on some of these indexes, we take out gas and food because they're, not susceptible to monetary policy, and they're, like driven by external factors. Well, that's very nice, but gas and food is the most visible things for people and pretty big chunks of their income too, right? So I don't know. I mean, what do you think about the political economy of inflation, if I can put it that way?
Well, I agree with you that, gasoline is a very salient product. People are constantly confronted with the prices. It's difficult for many working people to substitute away from gasoline because they need to buy gas to get to work and to drop off the children at school and things like that. And so I think that makes demand for it relatively inelastic, and that makes it particularly frustrating when prices go up. And of course, the price of gas has gone up more than that of other products and services. Now, one thing I would say is, more of a positive spin on the gas situation. Prices have not gone up by as much as they did in 73, 74. They tripled more or less back then. Now they've doubled basically compared to a year ago or compared to before the pandemic. And so that shock's a little smaller. Also, the modern economy is a bit less oil intensive, is what the economists who study this call it, in the sense that the number of barrels of oil needed to produce a given amount of GDP has really come down quite a bit. I think the IMF estimate is that we used to in the 70s we needed about 800 barrels of oil to produce $1 million in real GDP, and now it's about 300 barrels of oil, right? So in that sense, it's a less important issue for the economy as a whole. For the U.S. as a nation, of course, it's become a little less damaging when oil prices go up because it's a relatively larger producer than it was back then. And so, the parallel is drawn very easily with the 70s just because it's such a salient aspect of that experience. But I really do think the situation is quite different. And so I think in political economy terms, if you want to call it that, I think that's positive, though. You never know with the voters what they respond to, right? Is it the number they see every few days, or is it their objective, so to speak, economic situation?
Well, and I think also it's their expectations, right? If everyone was sure that, okay, we're having this temporary bump and it's doubled, as you say, but it will gradually come back down. We've had that at times actually in the last 20 years, and it's been a short-term issue, but tends to kind of fade away a bit. But I don't know where some of the stuff I'm reading, just the headlines almost, suggest gas prices continue to go up at least for the next several months. Is that your sense? I mean,
well, it seems like the global economy will continue to recover, and it doesn't seem like Zelensky will be at the doors of the Kremlin within the next few weeks either, right? So I think both of those things suggest that prices will remain relatively high for a while.
And so short term, just a moment on 2022, probably gas prices are high and inflation is not that much lower than where it is now when people go vote in October, November.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to say.
I but think not a recession, or where are you on that debate?
Well, I mean, that an actual recession seems unlikely. We're getting pretty close to the end of the second quarter, and it seems like we'll end the second quarter with positive growth, not as high as maybe expected the end of last year, but positive growth. And so, the as you know, the technical definition of a recession is to have 2 quarters in a row of negative growth. If we have positive growth now, we will not have a recession before the election, because we'd need to have negative growth in the third and the fourth quarter. And of course, the fourth quarter doesn't end until after the election. So I don't think we'll be in recessionary terrain. Of course, people's perceptions may differ dramatically from what we economists decide is technically a recession.
I mean, we could be feeling kind of stagflation-y by in October, right?
Yeah, maybe. But, at the same time, we're seeing pretty significant growth still. The most recent jobs report saw, hundreds of thousands of new jobs getting created, people rejoining the labor force. And so all of that is pretty positive. It really isn't an environment of both inflation and negative growth. And so it is all a little more positive than that. But what we're really seeing, I think, is that the trade-off that policymakers, the decision that policymakers reached in the Great Recession, right, which was to have low inflation and relatively elevated unemployment.
This was 10, 12 years ago after the fiscal crisis.
And for the 8 years after that. That may be more palatable to people than full employment and higher inflation. Right. And part of it is, of course, the unemployment harms the people who are unemployed and their families, whereas the high levels of inflation harm everyone. And so I do think that, I think it's reasonable to go with the full employment, high inflation option, but politically, you're doing some damage to everyone's budget as opposed to a lot of damage to a small number of people's budget. Yeah.
The voters were pretty unhappy in 2010 and 2014, 2016 about the incumbent parties and even 2012.
But not really in 2012 or in 2014.
No, that was a closer
elevated employment.
Yes, but that was if the preceding party if the other party has presided within very recent memory, i.e. in 2008, over the worst economic crisis in 70 years, you probably get a little indulgence of like a little slower recovery than you'd like. But I agree. I mean, there's a trade-off. It's unclear politically which ultimately, for now, the inflation seems better.
Yeah, and midterms, I think, are different from a presidential election.
Fair enough. Yeah. So what about then, if we can get to the supply side, unless there's something else we need to say on the fiscal and monetary side, which feel free to interject or come back to. I mean, it does feel to me, you and I have discussed this, you've written about it quite a bit, actually, that just on a bunch of areas, and you pick whichever ones you want to begin with, which are real policy areas. And there are some supply side shocks, that China supply chain issues and energy prices were going to go up once we had the war in Europe and the attack on Ukraine and the reaction to it. But it does feel like there's not been a lot of policy innovation or just activity by the U.S. government to do what could be done to increase the supply of goods and services, which presumably would be both good for the economic growth and not inflationary, kind of the best of all worlds, right? But or maybe that's a bit of a fantasy. I don't know.
No, I think the basic logic is pretty straightforward, right? If you have too much aggregate demand, you smear it out over more aggregate supply, you get a lower price level, right? That's the basic idea, and we have ways to expand aggregate supply really on relatively short notice, right? So we can lower tariffs and other trade restrictions to expand the supplies from the rest of the world, which then has secondary impacts on the U.S. economy too, right? It's not just that you can buy goods more cheaply from abroad; it also forces U.S. companies to compete with those suppliers from abroad. Maybe obviously the most salient example of that in recent weeks has been the infant formula situation, where we had shortages in the U.S. at the same time that we had, really straight out bans on European infant formula. Now I understand that, public health people have very, strict preferences over what is good and what is bad and what should be allowed, what is not allowed, what should labels look like. But that is obviously a bizarre situation. It really highlights, in an extreme way, what those kinds of supply restrictions do.
And those are just government imposed supply restrictions in the sense that
for sure, you're not allowed.
You could change labeling rules, and maybe we'd pay some. I'm not, maybe there are reasons not to, but one could, in theory, not in theory, in practice, change these labeling rules, and
and I understand
flowing into the U.S. through Amazon and Walmart, and you wouldn't have Defense Department planes flying in baby formula.
That's right. So as someone said, you don't have to militarize the infant formula supplies; you have to legalize it. And it's true. And look, and I understand the administration may be hesitant to interfere with the FDA's decision making after all the fighting over vaccines, but this really, I think, should have been something that it was clear months ago that this is going to be an issue, and they could have just preemptively said, look, obviously there's not hundreds of babies dying in Germany and the Netherlands every week, and that infant formula is fine, and you can just import it maybe for a limited period of time while we figure out why those markets have gotten so segmented, while we negotiate with the European Union on maybe, reducing the restrictions there. But that I think it's a dramatic example. But of course, it's true in a to a lesser extent for other products, right? We still have trade restrictions in aluminum and steel, and then in imports of wood from Canada, and all kinds of product categories where if you remove the trade restrictions, you could lower prices in the U.S. and you would force U.S. suppliers to compete more directly. The most recent example of this is, of course, in solar panels, where now, again, the same scenario is unfolding. We have taken trade measures against solar panel imports from China, and as a result, there aren't enough solar panels, which, of course, undermines it doesn't just have inflationary effects, but it also undermines the administration's climate agenda. And then in response, what does the administration do? It doesn't say, okay, fine, we'll let you buy solar panels from China. No, it says, we're going to invoke the Defense Production Act to force domestic suppliers to produce more solar panels, right? It's really, this is how you get to completely unnecessary levels of central planning. If your response to unnecessary restrictions and to too much intervention is to say, okay, we're going to just layer an additional level of intervention on top of what we're already doing, the problems just keep becoming more complicated. And those additional layers of bureaucracy, I think, also make it harder to then respond to the next crisis in an agile way. And I think that's been an issue for this administration throughout. It seems like they feel like they have to respect every restriction that exists, and they can only build additional interventions on top of that, instead of saying, okay, this is not working. We're going to undo this system of complicated restriction and regulations, and let the supply side bloom a little bit. I think that's not just what they've done in trade. I think it's especially true in immigration as well. We can talk about that if you wish.
Yeah, no, I'm struck by just a couple of things, and then let's get to immigration. I mean, I'm struck that you said early on that the supply, if deregulated, let's just use that term, or untariffed or whatever, that the supply side reaction could be quite fast. I mean, I vaguely remember in studying economics decades ago that, the supply side is sort of takes longer. And of course, in some areas it probably does, right? You could say today that we're going to make it easier to permit oil and gas and so forth, but presumably that literally is not going to come online for months or a year or two. And same with some of the other, even solar, for example. These things can't be installed overnight. But you think the reaction on the supply side would be reasonably quick? We're not talking about 2 years from now having a better prospect.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Milton Friedman earlier. There's a classic debate he had with Heller, who had been previously the CEA chair, where they argue over whether monetary policy or fiscal policy is dominant, should be dominant in managing the business cycle. And Friedman's view is it should be monetary policy, it's fiscal policy. It takes too long to percolate. I think there's something to that. And you do see when the Fed changes interest rates, you immediately see long-term interest rates change. You see the prices of all kinds of assets adjust, right? And so some of that response really is immediate in a way that many fiscal policy interventions are not. I think you can see with some supply side measures, you can see similar responses, right? So tariffs are a good example, because you cut them and the next day prices are lower. I think that's very different from, we're going to do better early childhood education, and that will increase human capital, and that dramatically increases the supply of goods and services once those children who are now in their early childhood start producing, right? That's obviously a supply side policy that does not have an immediate impact. I think part of it is that a lot of the sort of supply side reform that people think of is more of that, maybe not as extreme, but is, you reduce some regulations, then investment will pick up, and eventually output goes up. That's quite different, I think, from restrictions on trade and immigration, where you really can have an almost immediate response and an almost immediately expanding supply side.
And I suppose if the Biden administration said, look, climate's important, but we're going to put it on a little bit of a back burner here for a year or two, and at least, and just, rapidly make it much easier to permit for oil and gas and so forth, and maybe even do some support for, LNG. I'm no expert in this area, but whatever medley you would want of freeing things up and a little bit of government, maybe even intervention. I suppose whatever, the stuff wouldn't show up tomorrow, but prices would reflect that going forward, right? I mean, you could have pretty quick price adjustment to anticipating more supply coming online.
Yeah, I'd say it'd be not as fast as cutting tariffs, but a lot faster than investment in early childhood education. Yeah. There, I think one thing the federal government should do, and of course this is a pure pipe dream, but the oil and gas industry has been subject to such massive amounts of policy uncertainty over the past decade that it's just very difficult, I think, to justify the levels of investment that we saw during the Obama administration. Ironically, I think there the ebbs and flows have been so extreme that maybe that's an area where the federal government it's one of those areas where it'd be nice if you had a stable, set of policies that both parties buy into more or less. It seems unlikely, but that would be particularly helpful there. Of course, especially on the oil side, you have international players with a lot of market power that the U.S., and this really is a parallel with the 70s, that the U.S. struggles to keep in line, and that the U.S. struggles to keep from really exploiting their market power. Right? We're now back in a situation where Biden is going to go beg the Saudi dictator to produce more oil, and it's just not a great situation. So I think while I understand the short-term political incentive for him to do that, it would have been, I think, helpful if a little more long-term thinking had gone into how to manage those shocks to prices, especially now that there's a domestic industry that is pretty sensitive to rapid price fluctuations.
Yeah, I think this is a more kind of conventional, kind of almost old-fashioned, both liberal and conservative, center left, center right point. There's the case for stability is just cost stability is underrated as a kind of contributor to economic growth and to investment, and therefore to growth. And this is where the solar panel thing, if you tell people, well, here's a 2-year incentive to build it, well, I don't know that you can really build a whole new plant because you have a 2-year waiver on some I guess that, right? I mean, there's a way in which all the reacting late and then reacting with another layer of regulations is really pretty suboptimal, I guess. Huh?
No, I completely agree.
Yeah. So on the supply side, immigration is kind of astonishing, right? There's a labor shortage and huge demand of people to come to this country, and we had Trump plus the pandemic really did cut real immigration, both legal and illegal, I think, very dramatically, right? The numbers are pretty astonishing. And is that hasn't changed? We're now a year and a half into
we really haven't recovered in any category, I think. So from, obviously the refugee program received a lot of attention because Trump got it so dramatically. But I think this fiscal year, with 4 months left, and we're at about 18,000, right? Yeah. So that we're nowhere near to hitting the ceiling that Biden announced of 125,000 refugees to be resettled, even though, there really are more refugees than in any time since maybe the post-war period that would be happy to resettle in the U.S. I think the way in which U.S. consulates abroad operate is a complete disaster, basically across the board, right? And this is not just, in countries where there's a lot of that we think of as countries where a lot of asylum seekers come from, and like, of course, they cannot apply at consulates, but people think typically, where the consulate's going to be dysfunctional, it's going to be in relatively poor countries. But it's true in Western Europe too. It's true in Canada. I think most of the consulates in Canada currently do not offer appointments for non-immigrant visas, right? It's just it's a completely dysfunctional set of operations. I don't really know where it comes from. I think part of it must be that the Biden administration is just worried that anything associated with immigration is going to harm them politically. It may also just be that it's been difficult for them to get the workforce to go back to producing at the levels they should be producing at. I think the foreign service officers, maybe the kind of workforce that, even though on the consular side, they just need to do pretty routine production work, right? They think of themselves as very much white collar workers who, should be enjoying the same remote work benefits that you and I enjoy with bookcases behind us. And so I think that may be a bit why it's been hard to ramp up production. I think an indication that may be the issue is that, for example, Social Security offices didn't reopen until 2 months ago. They were closed for 2 months, for 2 years, even when the rest of society went back to work. And of course, that is in-person work. A lot of older customers who can really use the in-person support as opposed to having to go through the mail or having to delay their help. And so I think that may be part of it. But of course, the administration can decide to prioritize the processing of visas and can hire more people, can force people to work harder. It's been very disappointing. They made big announcements at the beginning of the administration, but I think it was always clear that immigration legislation was not going to pass the Congress. And so they could have used their executive power. They've done it a little bit here and there, but really not to the extent that I think they should have, if they wanted to get some of the economic benefits of immigration. And also, I think in a way that must have disappointed some voters that the Democratic Party gained during the Trump era. I think it was such a salient issue, and I think pretty important to a lot of people who switched parties. And so I think they miscalculated there a little bit, and in a short-sighted way, because obviously it could have alleviated some of the inflationary pressures that we're now dealing with.
I do think, this is maybe just my bias, having, read the public interest from the beginning in the late 60s and 70s and 80s, and then coming to Washington in the Reagan administration, and then watching Clinton. There was kind of a neoconservative in the old-fashioned sense of that term, a neoliberal in the old-fashioned sense of that term, I suppose, reform government to make it more just effective and, fairly non-ideological, but let's not do stupid things, as to quote Obama actually on that. And let's, make certain things work just because it's a dead weight loss to the economy and society if it doesn't work well. And I'm just struck how little of that there is in the public. I think I'd say, frankly, in the Biden administration now, but also in the public discourse and in Congress. Neither Republicans are just, whatever they're doing in their identity politics, culture war stuff. The left, the real left, is not interested in that because they want to, have Medicare for all or something. And the center left, in theory, is sort of interested. I think you can find, I'm sure, papers by all your colleagues at Brookings and people who are now in the Biden administration that are intelligent about fixing this and fixing that. And but you just look around, and FDA, see whether it's FDA and CDC, or whether it's the consular services, or whether it's trade policy. Maybe there it's a little more ideological with trade and stuff, but just feels like it's not. Shouldn't someone be just improving the performance of the U.S. government at various levels? Or maybe that wouldn't make that much difference because at the end of the day, it's pretty marginal in its effect. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't think it's that marginal. I think it really extends across a lot of policy areas. So I think you see the reason why it's so expensive to build infrastructure in large U.S. cities, or the reason why it is so difficult to get the FDA to carry out its responsibilities in a reasonable way, or to get consular officers to process visa applications faster. I do think it's all, it's all driven by this. We don't really want to rock the boat. We believe in the expertise of these agencies, and we don't want to intervene directly, even though we are the leadership of the executive branch. I do think it is all a little similar, and it really is not just those areas. I think where the kind of reform, the sort of original neoconservative reform that you mentioned would be helpful. Right, it's true in housing policy, where of course housing costs have escalated in all of the large dense metros, just because it's impossible to get anything built. To the point where really in some places the only things you seem to be allowed to build is homeless encampments. That's not a good system, right? You can't build a rooming house, but you can build a homeless encampment. It's not a good situation. But we saw it even in the what I would regard as relatively successful response to COVID at first, right, where you had the CARES Act and subsequent legislation, you really saw that the Congress was working under pretty severe restriction on what it can and cannot implement, right? You first of all, you see the government just mailing out checks to everyone, which is in and of itself a sign that we don't really know how to target, and something that no other country, I think, would even really consider. Then you see the unemployment insurance payments, where everyone gets an additional $600 a week because we want to be more generous, but we can't fine tune it because state employment agencies can't, set a replacement rate that is fixed as opposed to an additional dollar amount. Then we have a PPP program where money flows to every small and medium-sized business, as opposed to the ones that lost revenue. We had support for state and local governments that was way too generous, in part because we don't have a good sense of what state and local tax revenues look like on a rolling basis, and we don't have automatic stabilizers set up that would automatically update and limit the amount of funds that would flow to state and local governments. Now, this time, that particular line of funding was too generous. Last time, of course, after the financial crisis, funding for state and local governments was probably too small. And so, right, so just because you don't have more sophisticated monitoring systems set up, you see areas that really can go in both directions, but that are quite bad. And if we look back at the COVID response, there's really a lot of additional money that went into those programs that you wouldn't have had to spend if you could have targeted just a little better, right, between UI and PPP and the state and local funds and the checks. If you could have shaved off a couple of trillion, right, that would mean that our national debt would be 10% lower, and maybe inflation would be a couple of points lower too, and we'd be talking about really an almost perfect crisis response. And a lot of that really is driven by the sort of day-to-day unwillingness to address what are ultimately just technical aspects of the system, right? Like, how can you multiply someone's unemployment benefit by a certain factor in a crisis situation? That's just a matter of having updated computer code that generates those payments. Do we have local governments report their revenues in an accessible, prompt way to state governments or to the federal government? All of those things, they require fixes that really wouldn't be that expensive, I think, if political leadership really set their minds to it.
Yeah, I mean, part of me, I've always slightly defended the kind of just mail out checks to everyone, give PPP to everyone, don't get into micromanaging, on the grounds that there would be some downside, of course, to trying to suddenly decide, well, this company really doesn't deserve it because they may not have really needed to fire those. There's a certain kind of common sense, I don't know what you call it, again, slightly neoconservative, but also New Deal case for not overthinking these things. And if you get satisficing rather than optimizing, and let's just get the checks out there, and we'll sort of fix it all later, and there's a little bit too much spillover, you live with it kind of thing.
Yeah, and you can have elements of that, right? We could have had an initial response that relied heavily on more across the board measures like what you're suggesting, but there was no reason why a year later we were still having adding fixed numbers of dollars to UI benefits. And that's what the ARP,
and that's really a product of a combination of the kind of federalism we have, which is pretty decentralized and complicated to therefore get the money through the states and localities to the people, and I suppose the kind of welfare state we have, which has been entitlements.
And on some level, right, maybe a justified fear of having these detailed data sets set up. But is that, ultimately the IRS has a lot of the data you would need. I don't know. I'm sympathetic toward the caveats you're hinting at, but I think those are, in the crisis situation, those way more heavily. I think sending out the additional rounds of checks in December 2020 and March 2020 was really indefensible.
2021,
right? And that's where you see the distrust of, we can't let the technocrats fine tune it because it'll take too long. You see that it gets transformed pretty easily in very base populism, where the Congress sends out $600. Trump says no, it has to be 2,000 because he got to put his name on the original round of checks. And then the two Democratic candidates for Senate adopts Trump's call for larger checks, and so you end up with an additional $450 billion that went to the checks and the ARP. Right? That was a big chunk of that program, and so I think like everything, right? You can take it a little too far.
You won't forget how much
too.
That Ossoff Warnock race and then their victory meant they sort of had to go ahead with
that's right
what they had campaigned on, and then Trump
which I understand, but
but it is a kind of big chunk of money to sort of just make hinge on a slightly a campaign promise that was entirely pulled out of thin air, basically, in terms of any analysis. Well, it's a very old-fashioned view that you should actually do like policy analysis and build into that analysis a kind of, I don't know what you call it, Hayekian or Aaron Wildowski-like, skepticism about government micro-targeting and micromanaging, but on the other hand, trying to be competent, efficient. Competent.
And it's $500 billion. At some point, the micro becomes the macro, right?
Well, that's a very interesting point. So of these different parts on the supply side, I'm just curious, energy, I guess, immigration, trade, housing, I don't know. Does one or two swamp the others, or are they all pretty much contributors to the general problem we now have?
I think I think they're all important. I think some of them are more important in the very short run, and others are more important for sort of long-term growth prospects. I think energy and trade, I think, are the ones where that have caused or could address some of the more immediate problems. I think immigration and housing are more important for the long-term growth prospects of the U.S. I think housing policy really has just been completely dysfunctional for a generation now, and it's good. You see now Buttigieg is trying to get some measures in place that would reward state and local governments for letting more housing be built. Because you can use transportation money as a stick or a carrot to do that, and you've seen. I think some initiatives at the state and local level too, to allow for more housing, especially in California, of course, where the problems have really escalated. But I don't think it's been enough to really reverse the trends of home prices just being completely out of whack with construction costs in large parts of America's major metro areas. Right, that makes sense in small places that are particularly desirable, like maybe alongside Central Park, right? But there's no reason why in Arlington County houses should be as expensive as they are. And so I think that's a big area. And then immigration, there's just obviously the partisan divide over that has deepened to a point where it's difficult to see any kind of new legislation get enacted that addresses some of the clear problems. And it's such a shame because I think for economic reasons, but also for national security reasons, for if you care about the progress of science and technology, the U.S. has such a great resource there, and it's just not exploiting it. And it's unfortunate. And it's I do think some of the arguments that do not get made, I think, would elevate the quality of the discussion. I think it's often about fairness in how to treat asylum seekers and undocumented immigrants, and in particular their children. And I think those arguments are important, but obviously they haven't convinced Republican voters or Republican politicians, right? I do think it's important to confront those politicians too with the consequences of their choices for the US's position relative to China or Russia, right? Just in terms of sheer population size, in being able to compete in new areas of technology and artificial intelligence. Just the sheer size of the economy obviously matters a ton for national security purposes, right? You'll hear immigration skeptics say, well, the only thing that matters is GDP per capita and not GDP overall. But that's just completely false when it comes to national security issues. And so I don't know. I think immigration advocates would do well to focus a little more on those kinds of arguments, I think.
It just feels like the arguments over the last decade or so of the actual and analytical arguments have gone are more clear on the benefits of immigration, really of all sorts, probably, but especially perhaps high skilled and H-1B visas and all this sort of stuff, and innovation, and if you care about the 21st century and all this technological breakthroughs. And that's not been translated at all, as far as I can tell, into actual policy. Other countries are doing it, incidentally. I mean, Canada, Britain, letting in
It's
people.
been strange. It's strange because you do see, right, a lot of the most prominent business leaders and scientists in the country are immigrants in a way that really I don't think was true 30, 40 years ago. Right? If you look at the leaders of the business world in the 80s, I don't think they looked the way they do now, right? From Musk to really a large number of tech leaders. It's plenty of immigrants. I agree with you on that. I think also on the even on the labor market consequences side of things and on the assimilation side of things, I think the social science evidence that's accumulated over the past decade or so is quite convincing that I don't think you can now make a good argument that native workers are really harmed by the influx even of lower skilled workers. And I think there are pretty good arguments that current immigrants and second generation immigrants are assimilating at the same rate as the immigrants in the sort of 1880 to 1920 period that are now often thought of as having assimilated quite well.
Yeah, no, it is striking, I think, how much the social sciences moved in that direction, is my sense. A couple more points, we'll let you go and let people go. Ukraine, I mean, just as a kind of, again, can't separate these things. Obviously, they're all happening together in real time, have interrelated effects. But if Putin doesn't go in and it's all, a threat and a bluff and a sort of, or a mild incursion, so to speak, in 3.5 months ago, how different is our economy and the global economy? How much are we looking at sort of the things that were built in from the pandemic and from the response to it and ARP, as we've been discussing, and how much of this is we've got a big war going on that's affecting energy and food a lot right there in Europe. I mean, what's your sense of that?
I mean, I think it's a pretty big difference. So if you believe the IMF numbers, it's reduced their estimate for GDP growth for the world in 2022 by maybe a point or so.
Wow.
Which is a ton, right? A little more in the EU, a little less elsewhere. And of course, it's mixed in with maybe higher than expected inflation, but it's really a major factor, through the effect on oil prices, through the effect of sanctions, not just on Russia, but on Russia's trading partners, especially in Europe, right? In Eastern Europe, Germany, the Netherlands, used to do a lot of business with Russia. Of course, the Ukrainian economy has been devastated by the conflict too. And so I do think it really is a big deal, not just because of the scale of the human suffering in Ukraine, the number of casualties in the war, or the despicable nature of the invasion. Also, I think the economic consequences are pretty serious too. But yeah, more concentrated in Europe than.
But they don't stop
than in the US.
Today. I mean, it's not as if the war goes on and something like the way it has been going last month, let's just say. I mean, it could.
Yeah,
and if our response remains the same,
I agree. There continues to be, I think, a bit of wishful thinking in Europe on this, which of course I think now everyone recognizes was rampant before the war, when Western European countries relied on Russian natural resources for much longer than they should have, in ways that made them very dependent on Russia and way too forgiving. I think clearly in retrospect, both in 2008 and 2014, when Russia previously engaged in this kind of aggression. What you're seeing now is this very gradual walking away from the use of Russian natural resources. Right, there's now a partial oil boycott, but not really. There's a few countries that have now been cut off from Russian gas, but of course, what honestly, what should happen is to preemptively start cutting those ties, not just as a punitive measure toward Russia, but as a preemptive way to remove some of Russia's leverage, right? Because instead, what you could have is a situation where we get to the next winter, which is really not that far out, where Russia once again will be able to threaten Western European countries by cutting off gas supplies. If we had started dealing with that 5 months ago, maybe we could have gotten the EU to a place where it wouldn't have to rely on Russian natural resources at all. Instead, none of that has happened, and we've been fighting a bit over gradually increasing sanctions in that area instead of just removing that economic weapon entirely.
Yeah, the passivity on the supply side, to use the term again, on energy on our part in particular, was we have so much more ability to ramp up production in all kinds of ways than Europe, but we have the ability to help Europe, obviously, and to get the stuff to get gas to Europe and so forth. I find kind of bewildered. It's just not it's as if you're fighting a war with pretty effectively, apparently, in terms of the weapons, and with one arm, and then the other arm is doing nothing. Where it's obviously very, very important both for fighting and for maintaining the alliance and so forth, but also for our economy and the economy of the world.
Now, in fairness, the sanctions regime, I think, has been more comprehensive and more aggressive than people expected. But
that's
that was in part
because
the expectations were so low after years and years of, maybe we should build another pipeline.
But the flip side of sanctions is then doing stuff to replace what you're sanctioning, especially if you regard it, as you say, as a semi-permanent thing, and going forward that you want to bring about, not just for now we have sanctions and they'll be gone in 3 months or something like that. It's a little, that seems a little crazy. Debt, did we make it through this pandemic and the last 2.5 years, as you said, getting back to trend and on GDP and with low unemployment at the terrible cost of borrowing against our future, or is that manageable in your view?
It was a big jump. So we went from about debt held by the public was at about 80% before the pandemic, and now it's about 100, right? So that is
of GDP.
Of GDP.
Of GDP.
And so that is a big increase. The outlook for the federal debt has been pretty disastrous for a while. So if you look 10, 20 years out, the numbers start escalating rapidly. We're currently at a deficit of about 4%, but just sort of even if we don't do anything, it's going to start drifting back toward about 6% a couple of years from now, and it doesn't get any better from there on out. At some point, either people have to continue to subsidize the U.S. federal government and just not care about future surpluses, which seems a little strange to count on, but there is, I think, a certain convenience to holding U.S. treasuries for a lot of international investors in particular. And I think you could make the argument that the way in which the U.S. managed to cut Russia off from the international financial system strengthens the value of dollar-denominated assets a bit. But that's a bit of a gamble. Instead, of course, what we should do is try to make structural reforms as quickly as possible to ease into a more sustainable fiscal regime. And I say as soon as possible because a lot of the spending ultimately goes to Social Security and Medicare, and you can't just change those from one day to another, right? Because they mostly benefit people who no longer work, and so who do not really have any kind of way to adjust to suddenly changes to their budgetary situation. Now, unfortunately, it looks like there is a bipartisan consensus now that Social Security and Medicare are untouchable. Of course, discretionary spending outside crisis days has been cut pretty dramatically, and it's difficult to cut more there. It would also, be harmful. I think a lot of the spending in research and science and those kinds of things are in that bucket of the budget. And so then what else is left? There's national security spending, which I think has gradually been crowded out a bit by all these big social insurance programs. But that's not great either, given the challenges in that area. And I think, if anything, should probably be increased, not reduced. And so, it's a difficult situation. That's all on the spending side. Of course, we could raise taxes too. There's some enthusiasm on the Democratic side to raise taxes on very select number of taxpayers that continues to decrease over time. Right now, the middle class goes up to, what's the latest, 400K a year. Right below that, you can't. I don't remember the exact number the pledge applied to, but Democrats have really moved over the past 15 decades. I think in part because the electoral coalition has changed, right? And with educational polarization, they now represent so many sort of upper middle class households in the top 10% of the income distribution. They can't come out and say we want to tax them. So that's difficult, right? Because then you're left with a small number of people. You can only tax so much, and you can't tax enough to finance the kind of welfare state that Western European countries have, or even a slightly smaller welfare state that Western European countries have. And then in addition, a military and broader national security apparatus of the size the US should have as the sort of the leader of the West.
And I guess interest costs go up a little.
It's tough. Something is going to have to give. I think I would assume for the time being, we'll just continue running larger deficits and then to see how that goes. But ultimately, we'll have to raise taxes either on the middle. We have to raise taxes on the middle class or dramatically restructure Social Security and Medicare.
And I guess just rolling over the debt is going to, interest rates it'll get rolled over at higher interest rates. And so just even if we were to keep it kind of constant as a percent, the financing of it would go up some over the next few years.
Yeah, that's right. And so, and there, the stock of debt really matters, of course, because if if the interest rates on the debt go up by 1 percentage point and debt held by the public is 100%, that means an additional 1% of spending.
Which is
for sure
kind of a lot. Yeah, it takes up a lot of what you might want to use for.
Because remember, right, that's 5% of the budget. Right? That's 1% of GDP, but 5% of the budget. It's not
right. Just on
additional interest.
Nothing. You're not getting anything for it. You're just paying the interest rate that the market demands. So that's a slight. Well, let's close on that. I mean, how worried are we looking at sort of just a really tough decade, maybe, of having to deal with all these problems, but not dealing with them very effectively, and they just kind of continue to mount gradually, and we sort of pay some price, but it's never dramatic enough to cause us to change things, or
obviously you can paint more positive scenarios too, right? We're at full employment now. Maybe inflation will come down rapidly as all the stimulus programs come to an end. There's some fiscal withdrawal. The Fed manages to raise interest rates, fast but not fast enough, and we're 2 years from now, we're at full employment still, but with 2.5% inflation. Then maybe some of the technological innovations we've seen over the past couple of decades in artificial intelligence and in biotech, maybe they start paying off even more. It puts us on a different growth path. We have colonies on the moon. I think there's some positive indications too. And as long as we grow fast enough, the federal debt is less of an issue, right? Because it becomes a smaller share of the economy. So I think there's some reasons to be optimistic. There's certainly reasons to be more optimistic than 2 years ago, when COVID had just hit, and really the outlook was completely different. And we were looking at over 10% unemployment. When would that end? Would we ever find a vaccine? I think on the economic side of things, it's worked out okay. Of course, in the US alone, 1 million people died, which is, not a great performance. And a lot of them, I think, could have easily been avoided. But, on the economic side of things, I think there's reason for cautious optimism.
That's an important point on the economic side. But I guess, just close with, how much of a price we pay for the political dysfunction, partisan polarization dysfunction, but also the kind of, let's call it, governmental dysfunction that we've been discussing in these last 10, 20 minutes. I mean, that becomes at some point, it's sort of what's the Adam Smith line, a lot of ruin in a nation. There's a lot of, bad bureaucracies that a growing democratic capitalist economy that's like ours, with a lot of positives underneath, can tolerate.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
put
I
up
mean, it's
with.
just a constant drag on growth in so many different ways, right? From public health policies to housing to
Yeah, it just
immigration.
seems like you add it up with health, housing, energy, trade, immigration. It starts to become, a little more than just, gee, this is a minor annoyance and causes a
For sure.
tiny
For sure.
decrease in growth, right? I mean,
For
at
sure.
some
So
point, the
for
system just.
housing alone, the estimates people make are pretty large, and how much bigger the GDP would be if it weren't for restrictive housing policies, because it keeps people from moving to the most productive places. It makes them focus on finding a place to live, as opposed to finding the occupation or the career that suits them the best. It's not ideal.
I just feel like if you could just get a reformist liberalism and or a reformist conservatism, both of which we've seen, of course, in modern history. It's not like this is like, whoa, impossible to imagine that a Mike Bloomberg type could take over New York and do a lot of good things that actually made everyone better off. I think it's fair to say, and or that you could have reforms at the federal level of a kind of sort of Reaganite type or Clintonian type that could be carried through further. But it is sort of discouraging how little sense there is in the public discourse, and certainly the political discourse, that's something to
Well,
really
maybe when the
embrace.
boomers finally take over from the silent generation, we can see
Yeah, that's right. I mean, well, that's also maybe not a great thing, having
young reform spirit. Yeah.
I do. I mean, last point, I guess, this is more political, but I mean, it does seem like these governor. I mentioned Bloomberg, but it does feel like if you went around the country and talked to governors and some of the mayors now, even there's a little more of a sense that this all has to happen. The housing stuff seems to be, there's more upset about it, more hopeful signs, maybe at the local level in a way than at the national level, though you'd think the obstacles are greater at the local level, and they have been in many ways. And I'd say in some of these other areas too, that if you went to, I don't know, some of these Colorado and so talk to Governor Polis or someone, you might find it feels like that might be the place change could come from. But DC certainly doesn't seem to be very receptive to that, and I'm sure AI briefs people on the Hill, and you're doing your best. But I am struck how little either party right now, and including the administration, which I think is maybe a little less obviously predictable, are interested in what just improvements that really aren't even very partisan.
Just getting the FDA and USCIS to be functional.
Yeah, that are not, shouldn't be, you wouldn't even think would be that controversial, that are kind of win-win in some ways. But yeah, that's a little worrisome, huh? But luckily, you're going to be briefing them all over the next few months from AEI and your colleagues, and we'll be weighing in, and hopefully we'll get out of this. But as you say, we shouldn't also forget the bigger picture, which is we could be a lot worse off than we are today, given the last 2.5 years, right?
That's right.
It's good, cautious.
Good positive note to close on.
The positive side of the dismal science. Why is it a dismal science? I never quite understood that. Isn't economics about like economic growth and and sort of all
it's about
that?
choices, Bill. People don't like to
make
choices.
Is that where it comes from? The sort of dismal science thing that it's. I don't know where this. Yeah, trade-offs and choices are very bad, even though they ultimately, if made intelligently, improve our well-being, right? So
that's right.
Stan Veuger, thank you very much for joining me for what I think has been an interesting and I hope helpful discussion for people on our current economic situation. And thank you all for joining us on Conversations.